Hey guys, Max here, and it should be pretty clear that today we're going to talk about what just happened in Ukraine in detail, why it is so important, why Russia has escalated the conflict in this way, and a few other things, so let's just get right into it. So now, for anyone living under a rock, what happened yesterday? Well, Russia made a decision on what to do during this whole Ukraine crisis. Putin came out and he gave a speech, a really long one that was televised to the entire world, basically talking about what Russia is going to do and why it's going to do that stuff. Now, as I said, this was a really long speech and he rambled an awful lot in Russian, of course. I don't speak Russian, but I've read a couple different translated versions, and we're going to cover the most important things that he spoke about. Now, the first really important thing to discuss is that Russia and Putin now recognizes the legitimacy, the independence of the two pro-Russian separatist states in eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia now basically says that they are real countries, legitimate, and they have nothing to do with Ukraine, and Ukraine has no sovereignty over them. We then saw Putin reiterate that Ukraine joining NATO is a direct threat to Russia's security, and that they have the right to try and oppose that to preserve their own national security. Then Putin went on a little bit of a rant, basically saying that Ukraine has no historical right to exist, that it was created by Russia or the Soviet Union, and that it has no tradition of statehood either. Then, to make his rant even just a little bit more deranged, he then spoke about decommunization of Ukraine and what Ukraine is doing. He got a little bit angry that the people in Ukraine have been tearing down statues of communist leaders and trying to erase history as he sees it, and he threatened to show Ukraine what real decommunization is. Now, this was a little bit odd. It wasn't entirely clear what he actually meant by that, and I'm not 100% sure that this is what he meant, but to me, it seemed like some kind of threat of invasion and destruction of Ukraine, as Putin had earlier claimed that Ukraine only exists because of communism, so he'll be getting rid of traces of communism by getting rid of Ukraine. To be perfectly honest though, that's just my opinion on what he meant by that. It was a very vague, weird little detour from his speech. It didn't make an awful lot of sense, and I don't think anyone knows exactly, except for Putin, what he meant by that whole tirade. Without a doubt though, it definitely came across as a threat. Now, following that, Putin then started to get a little bit angry at Ukraine for another reason, this time for not taking control of debts of the USSR back in 1994 after the breakup of the Soviet bloc. In short, back when the USSR broke up, when it broke up into its member states, Russia assumed a lot of the debts of the USSR, and Ukraine was supposed to give up some assets in exchange for not taking control of those debts. But these agreements that were made between Russia and Ukraine, they were never ratified by Ukraine, so they never became official, and Putin was very unhappy with this. He used it as sort of an attack on Ukraine's statehood as a whole, claiming that the country ought to be punished for not abiding by that agreement, and really it was all just some big precursor to violent action justifying Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. Then Russia switched targets a little bit and they started talking about NATO and especially America, the US within NATO. He specifically talked about Georgia joining NATO and how that went against what a lot of European states wanted, but that America did it anyway purely to spite and endanger Russia. Putin went so far as to say that NATO states still are unhappy about Georgia being in part of NATO, and that it was an example of the US trampling over the wants or desires of smaller countries in the organization. Putin then went on and likened this to the situation in Ukraine right now, with Ukraine trying to join NATO and the US being the only country that actually has an important say in whether Ukraine joins NATO, and the fact that a lot of other European states in NATO might not be happy about Ukraine joining, but that they wouldn't get a say. Putin then went on to talk about NATO itself, its existence, why it exists, and basically that it's to stand against Russia. He said that Ukraine joining NATO would be a springboard for attack on Russia, to a precursor for an invasion of the country as a whole, because the West just wants to destroy Russia. Finally, Putin spoke about Western sanctions, and he basically said that Russia is being blackmailed by the West, that it's all unjust, but because the West is scared of Russia, because they're scared of Russia getting stronger and more powerful, that's why these sanctions are coming, and that they aren't actually in response to specific actions of Russia, they would happen regardless of what Russia does, so why shouldn't Russia be aggressive and do as they please, because from Putin's point of view, the country will just be sanctioned either way. Now that was pretty much exactly what was said, or the main topics that Putin covered over the course of over an hour. Of course, as I said earlier, I read a translated version, but I don't think anyone is actually going to dispute what I said there. Most of it is verifiable fact, and I don't really think I brought my opinion into that situation too much. Now what happened next after this speech Well, Russian troops entered both disputed territories of Ukraine, supposedly as peacekeepers. Russia also put forward a new treaty that is about to be ratified, which allows Russian troops to enter these new states, coincidentally enough, and for them to create permanent military bases. Now, the details on this front are quite scarce. There are no details of how many troops will be crossing, if they will just be soldiers, or if there will be tanks and aircraft and artillery and missiles and all kinds of other military equipment, but likely everything is going to be moving in. There is now lots of new footage of Russian tanks moving into what looks like Ukraine, and it's pretty safe to say that loads of military personnel and equipment will be based in the east of this region. Now, what was the West's direct response to this? Well, it's still all ongoing, of course, so there's a decent chance that this video might be a little bit outdated when you actually watch it, so keep that in mind. But in short, there is worldwide condemnation of Russia's actions. No one is really happy with this escalation at all. There are only two countries in the world to recognize these two new states, and they are Russia and Belarus. NATO and its allies are obviously more vocal about condemning this action and not being happy about it at all, but lots of other countries are unhappy as well. Even China, a country that's obviously opposed to the US and the West in general, even they have supported Russia during this crisis up to this point, but this time they think Russia has gone a little bit too far and they're actually trying to tame tensions and bring things back down to a safer level. Now, sanctions are coming, or they're already here, though probably they are just too weak to make any kind of serious difference. Right away, Biden made an executive order banning business, investment, and trade to these disputed states, which Russia now claims are independent. This is pretty unimpactful, though. There's hardly any American involvement in those areas anyway, so this won't have a huge impact. It is possible that it turns out to be something useful in the future. There are large untapped gas reserves in these areas, and they will be out of reach of American or Western companies, but that is months, if not years down the line, and not really something we can speculate too much on right now. Now, the UK came out and it sanctioned 5 Russian banks in particular and 3 Russian oligarchs. To be honest though, again, these sanctions are a little bit pathetic. A little bit is actually too generous there. The oligarchs that have been named on this list have already been sanctioned by the West for the last 4 years, so this really isn't anything new. The EU, of course, has proposed some sanctions too, hitting Russian politicians, Russian state finances, and some trade. But again, just like the others, it's a very weak response. Each EU member state has to agree to these sanctions as well, and if just one country doesn't agree to them, then it all falls apart. One actual real development coming from Germany of all countries is that Nord Stream 2 is looking likely to be cancelled, finally, which isn't necessarily a huge development and is certainly necessary given the extent of this escalation, but it's good to see nonetheless. Now, the US, the UK, the EU, and every other country, of course, is thinking of more sanctions to come. The big ones to watch, in my opinion, are Russia being cut off from SWIFT, the international banking system, and that would be absolutely huge. It would devastate the Russian economy, it would make it incredibly difficult for them to trade with other countries, and it would put huge amounts of pressure on the Russian government to get things sorted and to de-escalate the situation. The second major sanction that we should be looking for is actual targeting of Russian oligarchs and the wealth that they've hidden outside of Russia in cities like London and Paris. Now, unfortunately, both of these actually coming to fruition are very unlikely for a few reasons. Firstly, banning Russia from SWIFT would be all out. Russia already got the harshest consequences, so why wouldn't they go further and invade the rest of Ukraine or spike tensions in countries like Finland or the Baltic nations as well? For that reason, the West sort of wants to hold this one back to keep it as leverage. The second they use it, they lose all that leverage, even if it is a very influential piece. Now, as for targeting Russian oligarchs, again, this is just very unlikely because this wealth being taken, being seized in the rest of the world would shake confidence of markets in the West, and it would cost the West an awful lot of money, but it would be very powerful and effective. These oligarchs are the base of power for Putin and his actions, and without them, he would be incapable of running the country. To be honest though, it's just not going to happen because the property market in cities like London and Paris and New York, which is inflated by this Russian money and this foreign investment, well, it would be hit really hard. One of the big reasons these apartments and these houses are so valuable is because they're seen as such an effective store of value, and millions of citizens in each of these countries would lose their wealth as the market dipped. Now, most of what I said there was fact, to be honest. I know my opinion slipped out a little bit, it always does, but most of what I said there is verifiable fact. But now I'm afraid it's time for my views to come out in full force. So if anyone who hates what I have to say, what I have to think, then it's time for you to stop watching unless you get triggered. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is the fact that this escalation actually makes perfect sense for Russia, and it was expected, to be honest, just not quite this quickly. I did think that Russia would slowly escalate to prolong the crisis as much as possible, and this is an acceleration which I didn't necessarily expect. I thought maybe we'd see another 2 weeks or so of Russian troops not leaving, maybe a few more Russian state media reporting on false flag attacks in the east of the country and general warmongering, but I didn't think it would come this quickly. This action, though, does still clearly line up with our thinking on Russia. It's the closest thing to invading Ukraine without actually invading Ukraine, and that's a very important thing. It's certainly enough to rattle markets, as we saw yesterday. It's enough to send gas and oil prices soaring up 3 to 5% across the board all over the world. It's enough to warrant some sanctions, but it's not enough for those sanctions to actually be impactful. Now, this action is probably enough to get the West to give out some more support to Ukrainian armed forces, sending more NLAW or Javelin missiles over, for example, but it's not quite enough to warrant thousands of NATO troops moving into Ukraine, which would be very detrimental to Russian aims. Basically, Russia was happy to escalate in this way because it perfectly served their goals. The West is too scared to escalate the situation, and they will only react to Russia's escalation, and this gives all initiative over to Russia. Evidence of this is the fact that Russia just threw diplomacy away, and still Western politicians are saying give talking a chance. In a few days, Biden and Putin were supposed to meet with each other to try and find some kind of solution to all of this, and out of nowhere, Russia came out with this announcement, throwing all that to the wind, and now people are thinking, what's the point in Biden even going to this talks if this is how Russia is going to behave? Now, destabilization of the West has obviously taken place here as well, one of the main reasons for Russia's actions that most people just entirely ignore. Take a look at what's going on in the UK, for example, and we have Stop the War organisations led by, frankly, idiots like Jeremy Corbyn, and they're calling for the West to back out of Ukraine and Eastern Europe entirely. And this is just utterly stupid, of course, but it's not surprising. What we've just seen is something turn out perfectly for Russia, which means one thing: they will try and push it further. No gambler stops betting when they're on a winning streak, do they? Russia has just secured that territory for basically forever. Those states now 100% are puppets of Russia and nothing else. Russia also has another permanent foothold in Ukraine, which violates their sovereignty. Their troops will never leave Belarus either. Ukraine will always be surrounded on 3 fronts, and sanctions on Russia are weak and pathetic and not at all influential enough to actually convince Russia to back down. And yet, despite the fact that this escalation is just enough to annoy us all but not enough to actually warrant a real reaction, our politics is still being consumed by this crisis, as are our markets as well. Destabilization has taken place, and I've said this time and time again. It is the main priority, and it's going swimmingly for Russia. We should absolutely expect more, and every time Russia wins, we should expect more again. Now, what is next? Well, there are a few options. The first one is full control of the Donbas region. Right now, Russia recognized the independence of these entire regions which are contested, but only half of these regions are actually controlled by those rebels. So next is stabilization of these new Russian allied states, and then probably expansion of those states further into Ukraine to take over the rest of the contested regions. We can expect false flag attacks to justify this expansion to continue, run by state-run Russian media. Missile or artillery strikes hitting Russian soldiers in particular would be a major false flag attack and would probably be enough for Russia to justify a much larger incursion into Ukraine. Again, we should expect more rhetoric coming from Russia as well, that Ukraine has no right to exist, that it doesn't have a situation or a history of statehood, that it owes Russia due to the failed talks from 1994 and the end of the USSR. We should expect the movement of citizens between Russia and these new states to increase their authority over the states and to increase their control and legitimacy of that control as well. We should expect continued cyber attacks against Ukraine just to keep them on their toes and keep their nation destabilized. Ultimately, a full invasion of Ukraine is still unlikely in my opinion. It would just cause too many problems for Russia. There are 40 million people in Ukraine, and that is just too many to police for a small country like Russia. Their military isn't as capable as they'd have you believe as well. The majority of this populace would be hostile, and they would have to win a full-on war first, and you just have to imagine a Chechen war on a scale far, far larger to see how poorly that might go for Russia. On top of that, a full-on invasion would 100% enact a strong response from NATO, unlike this most recent move, which was perfectly sized and perfectly calculated to stay below the threshold for a major response from the West. What does this all mean though? Well, 100% Russia is the aggressor. There is no room for debate here anymore. It's a simple fact, and if you disagree with me, then I'm sorry, but there's no point in us talking because you can't be convinced. Russia is also winning this escalation, and they will continue to win until they accidentally misjudge a situation and they go too far because the West is scared of putting on real impactful sanctions. This situation is not over, and it's not even close to being over either. It will probably last for, without a doubt, a few more months and maybe a few more years. There will of course be spikes in tensions along the way, crisis points and flashpoints, maybe more civilian airliners being shot down by these Russian separatists. We're not entirely sure, but these points will continue to arise. Stoic Finance will of course keep you updated. It will keep you informed. I will make sure that happens. I'll work to make sure, especially with how the situation will impact the markets like we did earlier today. Now that is it for the day, guys. If you enjoyed this video, then leave a like and a comment to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that allows you to buy fractional shares of art from world famous artists like Banksy, which can be a great way to diversify your portfolio with non-market correlated assets. It's completely free to sign up. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to hand over any card information. So if that sounds interesting, then make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BlockFi, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get 9% interest on stablecoins like USDC, which is a far higher rate than you get from any savings account these days. Just make sure not to use Tether. Personally, I'm holding about £55,000 right now in cash on stablecoin sites like BlockFi. Thank you all for the support. Thanks for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.